latest in operations. Unredacted with Rachel Marsden, lifting the black ink to reveal the covert information and in-ground global events. And now, here is your host, Marsden.
Hey everybody, I'm Rachel Marsden. Welcome to Unredacted. Thanks so much for joining us. Welcome. I'm joining you live, as always, from the EU, SSR, the European Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and the capital city of Paris, France. And today we have a great show for you. And joining me within the next 10-12 minutes will be Scott Ritter, former United Nations weapons inspector and Marine Corps intelligence officer. We're going to talk about Ukraine and his take on that. We're going to talk about the biological research laboratories evoked by Vladimir Putin and even evoked in congressional hearings in the United States. The United States government was apparently concerned that Russia might have been able to get their hands on those research facilities. Why were they so concerned? We're going to talk to Scott Ritter about those and what it means. Is it just basic illness, virus research that we're talking about, or is it something more nefarious? It's worth looking into. And we're also going to talk about the fact that it's the 19th anniversary this month of the onset of the war in Iraq back in 2003. And we're going to hear from Scott Ritter what things looked like at that time. If you recall, he blew the whistle on the fact, the notion of Iraq having weapons of mass destruction, and he paid a very heavy price for doing that. So we're going to talk to him about his experience at the time and what that experience of his might be able to inform with respect to what we're witnessing today and the events in the world as we speak. Now, just to let you know, quick and dirty newsflash. Turns out that there might be a little bit of progress with respect to peace in Ukraine. Peace negotiations or talks resumed today in Turkey between the Ukraine and Russian sides. And apparently, as a result, I'm not sure if this is a good faith move or what, but it appears that Russia has decided to cease or to have a ceasefire and military action or halt military action in and around Kiev during these talks. So that's a positive sign. We'll see what that means. I know that it's being portrayed by the British press, which for some reason has just torqued everything that's going on in this conflict against Russia. I mean, Russia can't do anything right in terms of what the British press is trying to convey. You know, if, for example, in this particular scenario, they're saying, well, the reason why Russia has decided to halt military action in Kiev on the ground is because they're losing, so it's a withdrawal, rather than framing it as potential sign of goodwill. So you either believe that Russia is being barbaric in Ukraine, that they're no holds bar going crazy and Putin psychotic, if you believe some reports of the British press, or they're completely incompetent and losing and completely useless. It reminds me a bit of during the Bush administration, when Bush was either portrayed as like some Machiavellian genius or and a blathering idiot. So take a pick, because those two things don't really reconcile that well. So speaking of blithering idiots, that's a pretty good segue actually for what I'm going to talk about right now. Turns out Joe Biden has, for whatever reason, doesn't have the ability to filter his words because he's flat out admitting that the US policy towards Russia goes far beyond this conflict to full-on regime change targeting Vladimir Putin. Listen to what he said during a visit to Warsaw, which was Warsaw, Poland, a few days ago, in a speech that was meant to rally the Western troops in favor of Ukraine. This is Joe Biden at the podium. All right. Here we go.
For God's sake, this man cannot remain in power. God bless you all, and may God defend our freedom, and may God protect our troops. Thank you for your patience. Thank you.
All right. So you heard what he said. He said, for God's sake, this man cannot remain in power. Now, I don't know what there is confusing about what he just said, but the White House tried to reframe those words to say it's not a shift in policy. And they're right about that, actually. It's not a shift in policy. It's long been the policy of Washington to regime change Vladimir Putin right out of power. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been so invested in Ukraine. And using Ukraine as a useful tool, a sharp wedge against to create chaos for Russia or in Russia, and notably for Vladimir Putin. Otherwise, they wouldn't have any interest in Ukraine if it wasn't about creating some weaknesses right on the border of Russia or dragging Russia into some kind of chaotic situation. So he said the quiet part out loud. And even Secretary of State Antony Blinken tried to walk it back by saying, no, that's not our official policy. And again, he said, no, it doesn't mean that anything's changed. Well, nobody's saying that things have changed and suddenly regime change is on the table for Russia. We know it has been. Nobody has wanted to admit that all of this talk about spreading democracy and freedom worldwide by Washington in countries on the other side of the planet that just happen to have, interests that they are attached to, or interests with regards to unaligned or non-aligned countries that Washington would love to get its hands on or to control, like Russia, like Iran, like Syria, like Libya, like Bolivia, we're I don't even know where to stop when we start talking about use of countries as proxies to affect change that to the benefit of US foreign policy. But that's not new. Biden just said it. That's new. How might that change things? Well, for one, up till now, it's always been, if anybody like in Russia or Iran said, well, they have an agenda for regime change, up until now, because it didn't come out of the president's mouth, there's been some plausible deniability. I mean, it's come out of other people's mouths. For example, John Bolton was always talking about regime changing Iran, right? Even when he was the chief national security advisor for Donald Trump, he was always talking about that, but it never came out of the president's mouth. And keep in mind, they might say, well, it's not our policy, plausible deniability, but the president is the ultimate arbiter of US foreign policy. He flat out said it. And he's not even really denying that he said it or they meant it. He tried to walk it back slightly by saying, it was just me expressing my moral outrage. His moral outrage about Putin having no authority to govern as far as he's concerned, and needing to remove him from power. And he talks from his lofty perch of 40% popular support within the United States. Sounds like good moral authority for his moral outrage to me. So what does it change? Probably a lot, because now nobody can really, knowing that they're targeted, like Vladimir Putin, like leaders of other countries that are not aligned with the United States and its foreign policy, they cannot for a second believe that regime change is not going to come for them. And that will absolutely impact on their behavior and the way that they negotiate with the United States, their ability to have good faith in any conflict or points of contention. For example, right now, after Joe Biden let loose with his true feelings and true US foreign policy objectives with respect to Vladimir Putin, do you really think that Vladimir Putin is going to go easy in the negotiations with Ukraine, knowing, of course, that Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky is running interference between his country's interests and Washington's interests constantly, that he doesn't breathe without consulting his Western partners who are giving him weapons and support and promises of who knows what else? I suspect that those words are going to have a heavy impact on these negotiations. And whereas Vladimir Putin might have previously been willing to be concessional towards such things as, how much weaponry Ukraine can possess post peace accord after this conflict, how militarized they can be, whereas he might have been a little more forgiving with respect to that. He may not be so much now. He also is probably going to want those regions, those independent regions on the border of Russia, to remain that way, because obviously now not having that buffer constitutes a existential threat for him now that Biden has let loose on his true feelings. So I don't think anything good is going to come of it, either in this conflict or in other conflicts, because other world leaders are never going to be able to take at face value that regime change isn't the official policy of the United States. There's always been that plausible deniability. It's now gone. So we'll see what happens. All right, so I see that my guest is online, and so I'm going to quickly introduce him without further ado. Scott Ritter, thank you so much for joining us. I was just telling the audience that you're a former United Nations weapons inspector, and you're also a Marine Corps intelligence officer. So you have a very interesting, informed perspective on what is happening in Ukraine and more globally with respect to U.S. foreign policy and actions by the various actors in this conflict. Welcome to the show. It's an honor to have you.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
All right. So first thing, I know this falls squarely within your area of expertise, and I want to get right to it. There's been a lot of talk about chemical weapons or weapons of mass destruction that the United States claims that Russia could feasibly use, or is warning the world that, Russia could very well use something like that in Ukraine, and it represents a danger for the world. But we haven't seen evidence of that, right? So what do you think is going on here?
Well, first of all, we didn't hear about this until after the Russians captured intact at least two of the up to 26 United States Department of Defense funded and operated biological research facilities on Ukrainian territory. Prior to that, we never heard word one from the U.S. administration, the Zelensky government, or anybody that Russia was going to be using biological or chemical weapons. Suddenly, now that Russia has gained control over documents that at a minimum, require the United States to explain something that appears to be an illegal, treaty violating offensive biological warfare research program conducted under the auspices of the Department of Defense on the soil of Ukraine, specifically targeting Russia. I mean, that's the reality of what we're dealing with. One of these programs that the Russians now have document-based proof was going on. It involved genetically modified avian flu, and the genetic modification we're talking about is so that it specifically targets Russian Slavic people, not Ukrainian Slavs. They were specifically ordered to make sure that Ukrainians weren't involved in this, only Russians, that could be vectored against Russia using migratory birds. I have been involved in defensive chemical and biological warfare activities. Some of it causes me to scratch my head and wonder why we're allowed to do this, because if you can produce chemical weapons on a small scale, you can produce them on a large scale, and we are producing them on a small scale today. We're doing the same with biological weapons. I think almost everybody is familiar with the anthrax attack that took place in the aftermath of 9/11. It turns out that the anthrax that was used was produced by the United States government at Dugway, Utah, again, using one of these small laboratory scale production facilities. But we saw how a small amount of dry powdered anthrax can cause a huge amount of problems. So I can guarantee you that if we found similar activities taking place on the soil of other nations like Iran, North Korea, et cetera, we would scream and cry and say this is a huge threat to the world, because it is. But we get to do it. So I know that the U.S. government sometimes operates in a gray zone, but there's no gray zone that can explain away this bird flu vectored by migratory birds specifically targeting Russia as a simple research activity or a defensive warfare activity. So having been caught out, the first thing the United States did is say, this is all a lie, and this is proof that Russia is preparing the world for a biological warfare action, a false flag that they're going to blame the United States for. It's total fiction. Doesn't exist, isn't happening. Russia's not considering it, but it's deflection by the United States. And while they were deflecting, because we don't have a history of accusing the Russians in recent times of illicit biological warfare programs, we expanded it to include chemical attack, because we have in recent times accused the Russians of using a very lethal chemical agent called Novichok, targeting the Skripals, the KGB defector and his daughter that were living in England, the world's most dangerous chemical substance, and they both survived, and accused them of also targeting Navalny, the Russian political opposition figure. Again, the world's most dangerous, lethal chemical agent ever, and Navalny survived. And we also need to point out that neither the British in the case of the Skripals nor the Germans in the case of Navalny have provided the proof. They say they have the proof. They say their laboratories have done X, Y, and Z, but every time the Russians have asked for the specific laboratory results to be provided, as is required under the protocols of the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, which got involved in assessing this material, they've been denied. So all we have is accusations. We have no de facto evidence. I'm not saying the Russians are clean on this. I'm saying there's no evidence that they're guilty. I'm somebody who firmly believes in the notion that you're shrouded with the cloak of innocence until proven guilty, that you can't be found guilty simply because an allegation has been put out there. And all we have regarding the use of Novichok by the Russians against the Skripals and Navalny are allegations that are not founded in fact. And then you combine that with what they're calling the Russian playbook in Syria. I've always been curious about that because I have yet to see the Russian playbook. And if there was a Russian playbook, it certainly wouldn't have the pages that are being taken out by the people accusing Russia, because they're accusing Russia of facilitating Syrian government chemical weapons attacks against Syrian civilians. As they say, therefore, because the Russians have collaborated with the Syrians to attack Syrian civilians, it only makes sense that Russia would use chemical weapons in Ukraine against Ukrainian civilians. But again, the facts just don't sustain this. One, we know that Russia worked with the OPCW and the United Nations. It was at the behest of Russia that Syria actually joined the OPCW and was disarmed of its chemical weapons capability, the protection facilities, and the nerve agent and weapons that they had stored. It was verified that they were disarmed. Now, there was some question about the totality of disarmament because Syria at that time was engaged in a massive civil war. I don't like to use the term civil war because that implies Syrian on Syrian. It was a conflict between the Syrian government and foreign-funded jihadists. The Al-Qaedas of the world, the ISISes of the world that we, the United States, were supporting, by the way, in their effort to overthrow Saddam or Bashar al-Assad. But the evidence shows that if there was a chemical attack, for instance, let's take Khan Sheikhoun, a town just south of Idlib in central Syria, where a Syrian Air Force Su-22 fitter ground attack aircraft was accused of dropping a single sarin bomb in the village, and then the sarin nerve agent spread out and killed hundreds of people, or dozens, we'll say. First of all, none of the evidence that points to that shows that even occurred. That yes, an Su-22 did fly, but the radar tracking is inconsistent with the direction of drop of the weapon, meaning that if the airplane's flying this way, if you do a crater analysis, the bomb's dropping this way. I don't know how. I used to fly OA-4s and OV-10s, not fly, I was a backseater, but we would deliver ordnance. It would be one hell of a trick, something straight out of that movie with Angelina Jolie, where the guy can spin the bullet by shooting the gun and it moves around people, to fly this direction, drop a bomb, and have it magically maneuver so it lands in this direction. So that's one thing. Two, the OPCW inspectors never got on site. And I'll tell you, as somebody who did inspections in Iraq, the chain of custody is imperative when it comes time to pointing an accusatory finger. Because again, you can't accuse someone, you have to prove it. And that requires an OPCW inspector to physically come to the site and physically carry out an inspection using a strict protocol, securing the evidence through a chain of custody that goes from the point of collection to the laboratory. Anytime you break that chain of custody, you no longer have evidence. That's just the way the world works. And instead, the OPCW allowed these Syrian rebels to collect the data in a Keystone Cop farce. I mean, the guy who's collecting it is wearing a hazmat suit. Yes, it looks good, except when you see on the back it says training, which means if it was real sarin, he'd be dead. But the guy next to him taking the samples from him is a guy in sandals with no gloves, no mask, everything exposed. So he's receiving contaminated material, and yet he's not doing the goat dance. This is what happens when a nerve agent hit you. You start twitching and you die. So it's an absurdity from the beginning. This is more than likely a false flag carried out by the terrorists for the purpose of getting the United States and others to intervene on their behalf, which occurred later in 2017 in Douma, where a similar false flag took place, where the United States, Great Britain, and France actually did bomb Syria. If you remember, the United States got up there and said, with all the confidence in the world, they used sarin nerve agent, and the sites we have struck were associated with the production, the storage, and the operational employment of sarin nerve agent. Whoops, except it was conclusively shown that there was no sarin nerve agent employed. So ask the question, what did you bomb? You just made it up, didn't you? It's the Americans making up. And that's a long way of saying there is no Russian playbook for chemical use in Syria because the Russians didn't use nerve gas in Syria. The Russians actually worked with the Syrians to disarm themselves of nerve agent and worked with the Syrians to disprove the unfounded allegations of chemical weapons use. The Russians don't have chemical weapons, or if they do, let's say the Novichok stuff's true, It's a very small amount that's kept in the drawer of the KGB to be used in an inconclusive, incompetent fashion against targeted individuals. Because that's the only way I can explain the Skripals living and Navalny living. But there's no chemical weapons capability. This is just manufactured by the United States to, one, deflect away from the horrific PR problem we have regarding the biological research facilities, and two, to create the notion that America's words have gravitas. Because if you've accused the Russians of being prepared to launch a biological and chemical attack, and you say, if you do, there will be consequences, and then the Russians don't, you get to say, see, they took it seriously. And it's just, again, it's all a facade, it's all an acting game.
Yeah, and I'm just wondering what your experience was back when you were a UN weapons inspector with respect to the British government, because what I'm seeing in this particular conflict is just absurd press coverage of what's going on in this conflict in the British media. And I don't know why it's so absurd. For example, today, I'm not sure if you've been following everything. Usually you do follow everything. I follow you on Twitter and I noticed that you're right up on everything, probably more so than I am with respect to what's going on today. But it seems to be a will on the part of Russia amid these negotiations between Russia and Ukraine to show that, okay, there's some goodwill here. So apparently there's a freezing of military activity on the part of Russia around Kiev right now. Well, it seems like it's a sign of goodwill on the part of Moscow. But right away, the British press, the British press was framing it as, oh, well, look, Russia's running home with its tail between its legs. It's letting go of Kiev because, well, they're incompetent and they're losing the war. And every single take in the British press is just so absurd that it's always torqued in that direction against Russia. And Russia, it doesn't matter if Russia is incompetent, they're losing. If they're too strong and doing too much damage, then they're also losing. I mean, they just can't seem to get their story consistent and straight. But I mean, what was your experience with the British government?
Well, I have to say, when I first started with the UN in 1991, and I had extensive high-level contact with the British. I was working with the Director of Defense Intelligence Service and then his various organizations. I met with the head of the Privy Council for the Prime Minister. I met with Parliament. It's not that I was just going over and meeting, Corporal, Joe, who would have been fun to meet because he would have taken me to a pub and we would have gotten drunk. But I was meeting with people that mattered. And I will tell you that early on, the British were assiduous in providing us with specifically tailored intelligence and operational support to carry out our mission. And they were one of our chief allies in pushing back against the regime change policies of the United States. The British were committed to disarmament. And this continued up until the spring of 1998, when the British government made a strategic decision that weapons inspections were no longer viable in their point, meaning that they believed that we were not going to be able to accomplish the mission, not because of our failings, but because the United States would never let us finish the mission, and that it was in their best interest to jump ship and join the United States, at which point they entered the realm of the ridiculous. To give you an example, we had a operation that I worked with British MI6 called Mass Appeal. It was approved by the chairman, so I don't want anybody to think that I was going rogue. Nothing I did happened unless it was approved by the United Nations executive chairman. But it was working with the British intelligence to take. They had a program that within MI6 they call information operations. It's basically black propaganda. The British intelligence has greater latitude than, say, the CIA to control British press. So in every major British media outlet, MI6 has controlled persons, either working directly for them or contracted to them, some sort of relationship that they can plant information, disinformation in this case. And they also have that with foreign press. They can pick up the phone and plant a story in an Indian newspaper, or a Pakistani newspaper, or a Polish newspaper. They're very effective this way. They claim they don't do it with the United States. I don't know. But my job was we collected a whole bunch of intelligence on Iraqi weapons of mass destruction. And if it was actionable, meaning that I could take it and launch a competent inspection that fell within the framework of legitimacy under the mandate given to me by the Security Council, then we kept that stuff top secret and we used it in the inspection. But a lot of this stuff was just very, it was flimsy. We called it Kurdant for Kurdish intelligence because it generally came from Kurdish controlled areas of Iraq, and it was just rumor. And we couldn't use it. But some of it had enough facts in it that made it look pretty cool. But we couldn't use it, so it just went to the bottom of the safe, and I kept it there in case I got additional intelligence that could be used to breathe life into it. Well, the British asked me to release this intelligence to them, and they would turn it over to a journalist who would turn it into a news story and publish it in the papers to create the impression that the Iraqis were breaking out in the WMD area. And we felt that this, from the UN perspective, we felt that this was important because Iraq was getting extensive support from the French and the Russians, especially in the propaganda effort to tear down the weapons inspectors. I mean, they targeted me in particular. I was the living embodiment of evil. When I went into Iraq, they put TV programs of dogs and getting hit and called me an evil dog, a CIA stew. I mean, I was everything. I mean, I was the world's worst person. I have some stories about that, but I wouldn't say that. But I'll just tell one. I was driving, and I had just arrived, and Iraqi TV, of course, put their wall-to-wall coverage of the evil Scott Ritter being there. And I was in a car with my British driver, and we stopped, and a school bus pulls up alongside, and it's full of Iraqi children with their teachers. They look out, and of course, there he is. They called me Abu Azamat, the father of all crises. They're looking at me going, Abu Azamat, Abu. And the teacher goes, and she starts doing a pro-Saddam slogan. Allah, Saddam Hussein. And they're all chanting it, getting to a frenzy. And the light's getting ready to turn. So I turn to him, I smile, and I wave. They immediately stop the chanting. They all wave back, smiling and everything, because there's no hatred there. They're just doing what they do. But the bottom line is, I was really picked on and reviled and attacked, and so were my fellow inspectors. And we felt there was need for us to carry out a counter attack in the information warfare spectrum. So we went this route. In retrospect, I wouldn't have done it because the key to our success as inspectors is our integrity. And even though I didn't do anything wrong per se, I obeyed the rules. I like to believe that every time I open my mouth and talk about Iraqi weapons of mass destruction, that it's fact-based and that I didn't get into the game of black propaganda. But the bottom line is the British did that, and they started attacking the inspectors. They turned the black propaganda against the inspectors. They changed in the summer of 1998, and they haven't come back since then. They've been in the game now of being in the American pocket, and I think that's what we're seeing now. And the way they're spinning what's going on, if you want to talk about the Russian redeployment, let's just start with the basics here. Russia is one of the most advanced militaries in the world. So why do we treat them like they're kindergartners?
Yeah, right.
Why do we suddenly go, these guys aren't capable of advanced military thought? All they're capable of is, I'm going to land and take Kiev. No, they don't want to take Kiev. Military math, there's 200,000 Russians fighting 600,000 Ukrainians. That flips the 1-to-3 ratio you need when attacking. You need 3 attackers for every defender to prevail. The Russians are coming in with 1 attacker for 3 defenders. So how do you shape the battlefield? Because the Russians are capable of really strategic thinking here. The first thing they need to do is get continuity of lines of communication support. That means they need to connect Crimea with Russia. And you do that through Mariupol. Mariupol was strategic objective number 1. Take that, make the land bridge. Why? Because with that connectivity, you now can maneuver your forces on interior lines of communication. Imagine modern military thinking being applied by the Russians. But the Ukrainians have so many more forces than you. So you have to do things like a feint. One feint was putting all the Russian Marines off the coast of Odessa and sailing them back and forth. And all the Ukrainians went, oh my God, we got to defend Odessa. They poured forces in there. Guess what those forces weren't doing while they were digging into Odessa? They weren't fighting the Russians in Mariupol. Now, 60,000 to 100,000 Russians in eastern Ukraine, who the Russians claim are getting ready to attack Donbass. You have to fix them in place so they can't maneuver to support Mariupol. So the DNR and LNR troops, supported by the Russians, grab them and start pushing them back, creating a buffer between those forces and Mariupol and preventing them from maneuvering. They're stuck in place. And then Kiev. Mm-hmm. Kiev is a city of over 3 million people. Do you honestly think that 40,000 Russian troops are going to take a city of 3 million people? Anybody who thinks that, please tell me who's selling you the dope, because I've never smoked marijuana, but I want to start now because that's one hell of a high. No, you're not going to take Kiev with 40,000 troops. What you are is going to threaten Kiev. And when the second you threaten Kiev, what's the first thing the Russians did? An airborne assault on an airport near Kiev. Not by enough troops that could go in and do anything, but by enough troops that made the Ukrainians wake up and say, oh my God, A, everything we have in the Kiev area stays in the Kiev area, and B, everything we have in Western Ukraine that could go to Eastern Ukraine and support Mariupol and others is diverted to Kiev. And the Russians have been carrying out a classic fixing feint. They pretend to attack, the enemy responds, and you hold them in place. And they've taken heavy casualties, by the way, because that's going to happen when 40,000 troops carry out constant probing operations against 120,000 Ukrainians. That's a tough battle, and they've been doing a heck of a job because they pinned them in. And then while all this was happening, the Russians were carrying out deep attacks against fuel. You've seen the photos, ammo, command and control, air, anti-air, long-range artillery, to the point right now where the Ukrainians don't have any effective capability in any of those areas. So now that the land bridge has been completed, phase one, what are the Russians going to do? They no longer need the feint. They've already degraded Ukraine's ability to rapidly move troops, so they're going to use maneuver. They're going to more rapidly disengage their elite offensive forces, the airborne troops and the First Guards Tank Army, and they're going to move them down to where they can engage in a double envelopment of the 60 to 100,000 Ukrainian troops that are fixed in place in eastern Ukraine, and then they will annihilate them. This is what's happening. Anybody who has studied Russian military tactics, studied Russian military operations, and knows anything about the military in general, what I call big arrow war, would know this. But the United States has forgotten big arrow war. We used to do it. The Gulf War, we did big arrow war. Even the Iraq invasion of 2003 was limited big arrow war, called medium arrow war. But for the last 20 years, we've been doing small arrow war with special operations forces taking the lead. These are the guys that hang out air-conditioned forward operating bases, lifting weights all day, eating high-carb food, and then they get perfect intelligence because there's nothing stopping the collection of intelligence. You have drones flying, you have everything doing. Perfect intelligence comes in, and then in the comfort of an air-conditioned room where there's no enemy artillery banging around, they plan the perfect operation. And then because there is no enemy air defense, they have perfect air assault, where they have perfect air support on scene. And they launch the perfect attack against the perfect building where they kick down the perfect door and they kill a house full of innocent civilians. And then they go back to their forward operating base and claim its victory. That's called small arrow war. And whenever they had a problem, and they always had problems, they called in the A-10s or the Apache helicopters who saved them. Imagine how many special forces we would have lost if the A-10, every time it came in, ran into 1,000 Stinger missiles. And they were all shot down. And the special forces no longer had close air support. Now the Taliban closed with and destroyed them with firepower and maneuver. So we've trained 2 generations of American military professionals to think with small arrows and think wrong. Everything has to be instant. If you
Shock
don't
and
kill,
awe.
pardon?
Shock and awe.
Shock and awe, but even shock and awe. I mean, if we can't kill Osama bin Laden in one night, it's a strategic defeat. The Russians aren't playing that game right now. They're fighting one of the most highly trained militaries in Europe. The Ukrainian military has, since 2015, been trained by NATO to NATO standards. They have been equipped to NATO standards. They are led to NATO standards. Many of their battalions are considered to be interoperable with NATO, meaning that you can plug a Ukrainian battalion out from Ukraine, plug it in anywhere in the NATO hierarchy infrastructure, and it will function compatible with everything else. This is why the Russians viewed it as a NATO proxy. This is why one of the primary Russian objectives is the demilitarization of Ukraine. Not the annihilation, but to deconstruct this NATO military force that had been built up on their borders. This is a very capable fighting organization. I never will denigrate the heroism and the tenacity and the professionalism of the Ukrainian soldier. They're putting up one hell of a fight, but they don't stand a chance because the Russians know what they're doing. The Russians have, before phase one ended, one of the objectives was there's 24 major maneuver brigades in the Ukrainian military. Every single one of those has been degraded to the point where they're not capable of carrying out coordinated operations with others. That doesn't mean that they're annihilated. It means they cannot function in the manner necessary for the next phase of operations, which is major maneuver warfare. Now the Russians are coming in with the First Guards Tank Army, and they're going to come sweeping in with rapid movement, rapid attacks, pincers, and the Ukrainians won't be able to respond because they'll be sitting there going, boo, 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 and they're going to either die or have to surrender. This is the next phase of the operation. It wouldn't happen if those Ukrainians were capable of coordinated defensive maneuver, because then the Russians could be in have trouble, because the Ukrainians are pretty good. They're very good, but very good troops and very good tanks are useless if you don't have fuel. Because you know what a tank is that's run out of gas? A coffin. You know what an artillery piece is? It has no more ammunition to shoot? It's a grave. Anybody standing there is going to die. And you know what a hungry, thirsty, tired Ukrainian soldier is? Either a corpse or a prisoner of war. And that's the future of the war in Ukraine.
Now, we've talked, or the Kremlin has referred to the end of the first phase, and they said it's going operationally according to their plan. Seems like an awful long time has passed for the end of phase one, for just the end of phase one. We're talking about a month worth of war. Do you see this accelerating in any way, or how long do you think we're in for with respect to this if peace doesn't get intervene?
I don't think peace is going to intervene until Russia wants to intervene. I think Russia's in control of the timeline. They're just playing the diplomatic game. Nothing was going to be resolved in Istanbul. They were always going back to their capitals for consultation. And the Russians are experts. I know, I've dealt with them, in dragging things out forever until the time is convenient for them to act. So I'm confident in Russian diplomacy being able to preserve Russia's strategic imperatives, which are twofold: demilitarization, denazification, which to achieve a singular political objective, which is non-NATO neutrality. So that's it. We just define it. And there's some other things in there about Donbass, and maybe Mariupol now is going to be a Russian city. I can't ever imagine that city going back to Ukrainian control after what the Azov battalion did. But let me start by saying that I'm someone who thought this would have gone a lot faster than it did, because I've studied Russian doctrine, I've studied Russian operations, and I believe that the Russians were going to take advantage of their overwhelming firepower supremacy, and just literally lay waste to everything in front of them, and then come in with a massed attack that just rolled over anything that survived, because that's what the Russians do. They did the exact opposite. They came in light. They came in, knocking on doors, trying to negotiate their way through towns and villages, saying, "Hey, we're not here to occupy you. We're here to simply to go do our mission. We, don't want to hurt civilians. We don't want to hurt civilian infrastructure." And they paid a heavy price, because whoever told them that the Ukrainians were going to be willing to do this got it wrong, because the Ukrainians said, "No, we're going to fight you," and they fought. But now the Russians have also taken the approach that even if the Ukrainians fight, we're still going to protect Ukrainian civilians and Ukrainian civilian infrastructure. People are going to say, well, what about all those blown up buildings? Well, that happens when you put fighting vehicles next to the building, when you use the basement of a school to store ammunition, when you put snipers in the upper floors of an apartment building, they lose their protection. But even then, the Russian actions are not indiscriminate. They fire, but then they go in with the infantry in the worst kind of fighting possible, where the infantry now has to close in an area that's been rubbleized and the enemy is dug in, and you got to get the enemy out without killing the 130 civilians in the basement, and the old grandma on floor 3, and the mother with 2 children on floor 4, because they know all that before they go in. So they fight this battle where they're losing guys, when the real solution, the Marine Corps solution, is to pull back, put 3 thermal barracks into the bottom, and collapse the building. We did that in Fallujah. You think we gave a rat's ass about any civilian in that building? No. There were Chechens dug in on floor 2. The thermal barracks came out. Building went down. There's no violation of the law of war, because that was collateral damage acceptable to the military advantage gained by the operation. But the Russians aren't playing that game. They're losing guys to save civilians, and they're not getting any credit for that in the West. But this takes time. This is time intensive. So the Russians have sacrificed the clock to do the right thing, which makes everything even more complicated, because a fixing operation works if I can violently come in and grab you and hold you. And now they're going to pound me in the face. I'm paying a price, but I'm holding you so that you can rapidly envelop. But there's no rapidly enveloping taking place. It's a slow, plodding movement to save civilian lives. So I'm getting the crap beat out of me trying to fix people in place. And then everybody's going, you're losing because you're losing people. Well, the Russians are losing people because they're trying to save lives. And they are. People say, well, wait a minute, Scott, there's so many thousands of dead. Let's look at the UN figures, 3,000 to 5,000 dead civilians. With 5,000 being, I think, a little unrealistically high, but we'll see. Mariupol could skew things dramatically once the numbers get up, but I think the numbers aren't going to be as high as they think, because a lot of the people that the Ukrainians are saying are dead actually fled to Russia. And once their names get counted, the number drops. But let's say there's 5,000. In the history of war, modern war, the combatant to civilian death ratio generally works out to 1-to-1. For every dead civilian, there's 1 dead combatant, and that includes combatants on both sides. Now, what do we have here? The Russians acknowledge, say, 1,500 dead. They've said that the Ukrainians have suffered 14,000 dead. So let's just call it a round number, 16,000. 16,000 combatant deaths. If you have 5,000, and that's a high number, let's say 3,000. 3,000 dead civilians. Right off the bat, you have a 5+to-1 ratio. For every 1 dead civilian, you have over 5 dead combatants. That's 5 times less lethal than what is normally expected in modern warfare. Why is it 5 times less lethal? It's not because of anything the Ukrainians are doing. We know they're digging into the cities. The Washington Post just published an article this morning that details how, they're saying this is a war crime. The Ukrainians are literally digging in next to apartment buildings, hazarding the civilians inside. That is the war crime, not the Russians pounding them in return. But even though the Ukrainians are using these tactics that have human shields put in place, the Russians aren't slaughtering the civilians, because the Russians have decided they're not playing that game. So they're going slow. So that's a long way of saying that phase 1 took as long as it did because the Russians were trying to minimize civilian casualties and damage to civilian infrastructure. Phase 2 will probably take a little bit longer than I might otherwise have thought if they used standard Russian doctrine, because they're going to try to save civilian life and save civilian infrastructure as much as possible, even though it costs them tactical and operational advantage. But strategically, the Russians are winning. They've achieved their phase 1 strategic objective, and they're going to achieve their phase 2 strategic objective.
Now, when you hear the Kremlin say that the objective is denazification of Ukraine, what do you hear by that? Because when I hear that, to me, it means urban warfare, guerrilla warfare, where you have a ground search to identify specific individuals. I mean, what do you hear as an operational objective?
Oh, no, it means they're going to kill or imprison every single Nazi in Ukraine, which they're doing with ruthful efficiency. And they're going to ensure that whatever exists in Ukraine as a government after this operation enacts legislation that outlaws this odious Nazi ideology, to include the disbanding of political parties that gave succor and support to this ideology. So the right sector and other political parties of this nature will no longer exist. That's what I see denazification being. And when I hear Peskov say, we're not changing any of our objectives, that helps me believe that they're not planning on negotiating away any advantage. Russia has lost far too many men and has suffered far too much as a nation. Even if you accept at face value, which I do, the Russian accounts of casualties, not the inflated ones you see in the West, but either way, it's a lot of guys, a lot of suffering, a big cost to the economy. I mean, this is costing billions of dollars, this war, and then the sanctions that have been imposed and the cost paid by the Russian people who are supporting this war. So the notion that Putin's going to negotiate this away and lose face with the Russian people and with his military is absurd in the extreme. So this war doesn't end until there's denazification. Denazification means everybody dies. And the Russians are doing that. Now, to give you an example of why I don't think this is going to go to guerrilla warfare. One, to guerrilla warfare, you have to be a fish swimming in the ocean. That's what Mao talked about. Well, the Russians control the ocean. So any fish is swimming in there, the Russians are going to get. And the Russians are identifying everything as a halibut. And if a carp comes swimming by, they're going to grab it and kill it. I mean, that's how good they are. And these Nazis, these odious, disgusting people, they've made a horrible mistake on their part because they have literally broadcast who they are and what they've done. Even when they try and get cute, for instance, the kneecapping of Russian prisoners of war that was broadcast a couple days ago. I don't know if you heard, but Russian Special Operations Forces have captured them, because that's what Russian Special Operation Forces do. They take the video, they take the digital data, the digital evidence, and then they have wonderful electronic warfare capability. They isolate the cell phone. They find out where it is, because the idiots continue to use the phone. And then they come in with their boys and grab them. And they got 2 of them right now, and they're going to get them all because that's what they do. And I can guarantee you that any Ukrainian wannabe partisan is going to suffer the same fate. So I don't have any confidence in the Ukrainians' ability to carry out meaningful guerrilla warfare. There are some special operations guys that are pretty good, and they've already shown their ability to infiltrate the Russian lines and to carry out a linear ambush in the Russian rear. But again, these are professional military guys, and at the end of the day, you can only dodge an axe so often. But when the axe finally hits you, you're dead. And these special operators are dodging axes right now, but the axe is going to hit them.
When we hear about X number of Russian generals who have gone missing or have turned up dead or just disappeared, I know that there are a lot more Russian generals than there are American generals, for example. So people have a hard time wrapping their minds around the importance of these figures that are being put out there and who these individuals are. But do you think there is any potential involvement on the part of US or NATO forces in find, fix, and finish missions targeting these Russian generals?
I think that I know we're probably involved. I can't say I know. I strongly suspect that we're probably involved. No, I mean, I can't say no because I don't know. I mean, I'm not being cute here. I gotta be careful with the words I use. I don't know. But I know how things are done, and I know how intelligence works, and I know what some of our capabilities are. And it would not surprise me. Look, the Russians have captured NATO-compatible Tempest laptops, which means that they can be plugged into a secure communications network, which means somebody in NATO can be sending secure data to a laptop that the Ukrainians can use. So we know there's the potential, at least, for secure connectivity. Let's assume that that's being used, that those laptops just aren't there for decoration purposes only. So somebody's passing classified data of an intelligence nature. This could include, order of battle information for the Russians. It can include, tactical information on deployment, etc. But it also could include targeting data relating to Russian command and control, Russian leadership, etc. And it could be close to real time or near real time, depending on who's collecting and who's receiving. So there's that potential. And then there's knowing joint special operations the way I think I know them. It wouldn't surprise me if there was something called advanced force operations taking place. But advanced force operations is covert intelligence collection, preparing the battlefield for the potential for the follow-on employment of joint special operations commandos. So I don't think they would use that capability to gather intelligence to give to the Ukrainians, because in doing so, you actually expose this covert force you have operating behind enemy lines, who, if they get caught, are going to be a deep embarrassment to the United States government and possibly, depending on how they're dressed, subject to summary execution. So I don't think they would do anything to raise their profile and by giving the Ukrainians intelligence they collect. I think the Ukrainians are receiving intelligence from other NATO intelligence platforms, and that they have used that to target the Russians, which the Russian generals, Russian leadership, which isn't hard. The Russians don't hide in bunkers. They don't hide in control aircraft. These are forward leaders. These are guys who are hands-on in their approach, who take their command posts into the battle zone. And sometimes they pay the ultimate price when things go wrong. They're being killed by artillery strikes. They're being killed in ambushes, and they may be killed by targeted assassination. Who knows? But they're losing them. But again, we're talking about extremely intense combat operations. I mean, again, this is the level of intensity that America hasn't seen since the short war we fought in Desert Storm. And even then, the Iraqis didn't put up nearly the resistance that the Ukrainians are putting up. So we haven't seen this kind of intense modern combat since World War II. And any World War II veteran, unfortunately, they're all dying off now, but they would have told you that was some of the most horrific experience they ever had, because there's nothing but death and destruction all around you. And the Russians and the Ukrainians are going through that kind of combat on a daily basis, 24/7, unrelenting.
Do you think there is a possibility of Western militaries getting more involved than they are in this conflict?
No, I think the West has written off Ukraine, and as they should. And I don't mean that as an insult to Ukrainians, but look, Barack Obama back in 2015 said that the West isn't going to fight and die for Ukraine. There's nothing in Ukraine worthy of American support. And that's been true all along. The West was never going to fight for Ukraine, ever going to fight for Ukraine. A lot of people forget, right now we have Zelensky on a pedestal.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of people forget that prior to the war, he was a failed president who was operating with 23% approval rating and collapsing, who had totally sold out to neo-Nazis, and who had arrested all of his political opposition. Remember, the great Democratic leader arrested all of his political opponents and shut down all opposition media. That's who Zelensky was before the war. Now we've turned him into this wonderful Churchillian figure, King Leonidas and his 300, and whatever else we want to wrap him with. But at the end of the day, he's a failed leader of a failed country, a kleptocracy that's one of the most corrupt places on planet Earth. So there was no way the West was going to fall on its sword for Ukraine. and there's no way they will.
What could he have done differently, Zelensky, to have prevented this, do you think? Do you think he could have told NATO to go screw off and to get out of the country?
No, first of all, the linkage with NATO was constitutionally mandated. The Ukrainians amended their constitution to make NATO membership and NATO activity required. So he was trapped there. He was trapped with legislation that elevated Stepan Bandera to a national hero, and gave legitimacy to the Nazis. And there was really nothing he could have done that he could have survived. I mean, yes, he could have said, "I agree to neutrality," and then Azov would have hung him by the neck on the main thoroughfare in Kiev, as they said they were going to do. People keep saying, "Well, why didn't Zelensky do that?" Because he would have died. It's not an idle threat. We have the videotape of the Azov guy saying it. Now, imagine me being in Washington, D.C., the head of a National Guard unit, and saying on air that if Biden doesn't do X, I'll hang him by the neck till he's dead on Pennsylvania Avenue. Wouldn't the Secret Service be kicking down my door, rightfully so, either killing me or arresting me? Yes, because you don't make threats to presidents in a democracy. But Ukraine is not a democracy. So when the senior Azov person says, "I'll kill Zelensky personally, we'll drag him out," and they threatened everybody, "If you don't do what we want here, we will Maidan you." That's the threat. "We will Maidan you," meaning a replay of the violent Maidan events in February of 2014. "We will Maidan you." They control the military. Any military officer that spoke up against them got beaten up, was told his family was going to die. They intimidated everybody. So what could Zelensky do? Nothing. And this is one of the frustrations of the Russians, because they needed Zelensky to do something. They needed Zelensky to agree to the Minsk Accords. But he wouldn't. He couldn't. Even though he said he would when he ran for office, as soon as he became president, Azov said, "If you agree to Minsk, you die."
So now perhaps he has a bit more wiggle room, given
Now?
that they're in the, now.
Well, this is, my belief, and again, this is just my belief. The only one who can give legitimacy to Russian terms of surrender is Zelensky, because he has been elevated to this godlike status, and the West has committed to whatever he accepts, we will accept. So from the Russian perspective, unless they want to be trapped in, the forever political conflict with the United States, where their sovereignty over Crimea is never accepted, sanctions because of their continued possession of Crimea will always be in place. And now we have the additional complexity of the Donbass and maybe Mariupol. The only way that this all can come to an end is for Zelensky and the Russians to accept terms that the rest of the world has no choice but to accept.
Yeah.
And this may be where Russia eventually makes some sort of compromise, because thinking strategically, are you better off getting the world to recognize Crimea as being a part of Russia, or do you pursue short-term feel-good objectives that will be forgotten in 5 years? Meanwhile, the world continues to sanction you because of your so-called illegitimate occupation of Crimea. So this is where Zelensky has more leverage than maybe he thinks, because he is the only one that can bring legitimacy to some of the more, in his opinion, extreme Russian demands. Now, in order for Zelensky to do this, he needs to survive as not only a leader, but as a country. And phase two, the Russian phase two military operation, is going to dramatically change the geopolitical calculus that's at play here. Because right now, the Ukrainian military still is a viable fighting force. It just can't fight the kind of war that Russia's getting ready to bring down on it. But it's still there. So if the war ended today, you could reconstitute the Ukrainian military in short order. So the Russians can't let the war end. They can't allow a long ceasefire. But if they destroy the military and collapse Zelensky to the point that he flees the country or is somehow killed, then they've shot themselves in the foot. because now they're going to be negotiating with somebody that can stay in Warsaw and never agree to terms. And then Russia's stuck with a rump state of Ukraine that, it will come up with a solution with, maybe bring in Yanukovych out of retirement, but nobody will recognize that. Nobody will respect that. And Russia has basically captured a giant tar baby. So Russia has to play a balancing game here that, they have to pressure Zelensky without killing Zelensky. They have to allow Zelensky to retain enough credibility as a leader without giving the Ukrainians too much capacity to kill Russians. Because at some point in time, the Russian military's got to stop this bleeding on the battlefield. They're going to have to end this war. And the only way you do that is by destroying the Ukrainian military. And so the gloves are going to come off. And I'm afraid phase 2 is going to be a lot more violent and a lot more bloody than than the already violent and bloody conflict we've seen.
Scott, I just want to let you know we had a comment that just came through. Scott Ritter is always the most honest and well-informed interview. I'm grateful for his insight, and we have a lot of people who are really grateful for your insight. A lot of people watching this live right now. I want to thank you personally for taking the time, being so generous with your time to come on with us today, and for sharing your formidable experience and insight into this conflict, which is just so comprehensive, and it really helps to kind of show us where we're going. And because a lot of us, if you're reading the mainstream press, you really have no idea, frankly.
Yeah, I agree.
Impossible. Scott Ritter, thank you so much again. Where can people find you online?
Well, I'm a Luddite, but my daughter has set me up on Twitter. So I have a Twitter account at Real Scott Ritter. And for now, that's it. I don't know. She's trying to get me to expand my horizons, so we'll see what happens in the future. But right now, I post everything I write on my Twitter account.
And I know you also write for certain media outlets. I've seen your work on RT.com, which I also write for them. And hey, you can still see RT.com in certain places in the world.
Well, I write for them. I write for Consortium News, and I get my stuff appears in other places on American outlets, legitimate American outlets without any warning labels attached. But but anything I write, I end up posting on my Twitter account, so people.
That's great. I'm sure people will be able to find you there. Again, thank you so much, and we'll have to get you back on at some point to talk about phase 2 as we get into that. And, yeah, exactly. Okay. Phase 2. We'll see what happens.
All right. Well, thank you.
Thank you
very
Scott.
much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. Bye. All right, everybody. So that is it for today's show. Thank you so much for your comments and your compliments. Remember, every show that we have here, you are more than welcome to send your questions through while you're watching live, and I'll be able to get them in front of our guests if they're relevant to the conversation. Obviously, there are some questions that come through that by the time I present them or am able to present them to the guests, because we've been chatting, sometimes we moved on to a bit of a different topic, so it's hard to come back to it. But I always try. And in the meantime, you can also reach me with your guest suggestions or comments at unredactedshow@gmail.com. You can also find my writing and reruns of this show via rachelmarsden.com, which is my personal website. So we will be back on Thursday at the same time, same place, whatever platform you happen to be watching on right now. And on Thursday, we are going to have at least one member of the European Parliament, maybe even two, who confronted Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau during his stint coming through and preaching to the European Parliament about freedom and democracy and human rights. And they confronted him with his treatment of the Freedom Convoy truckers protests in Canada, which was absolutely brutal and authoritarian. So those members of European Parliament, at least one, maybe even two, are going to come on this show on Thursday to talk about what that experience was like, confronting Trudeau directly in Parliament. Both of them got up and gave a speech, and brutally spoke out against Justin Trudeau and his behavior, his governance in Canada. Also, I want to just mention, just as a quick housekeeping point before we call it a day today, yes, I do realize that there are a few technical issues right now. This show launched a couple of weeks ago. The ring light, there will be a ring light. I do have a light, but there will be a ring light which should help improve things. I won't get my hands on that until the 15th of April. And um, we're going to see if we can improve the technical aspect. Sometimes it's out of my control. Sometimes it's at the other end of the feed. So it's not necessarily, I know that I was able to fix the connection issue. So that's already, I guess, a plus. You shouldn't hear any cutouts anymore. I think we have that resolved. So please bear with me. This is just being launched, and I'm still in the process of getting everything together and trying to improve the technical elements of the show as we go along. So thank you so much for your patience, and trust me, it will get better in those terms. So, all right, so we'll be back again Thursday. Thank you so much for tuning in. It's always a pleasure being with you, and join us again next time. Have a good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you happen to be, and take care.